The world was a symphony of sirens and screams, a chaotic opera of terror and relief. But through the flashing red and blue lights that sliced through the night, my eyes found him. He was a fixed point in a spinning universe, a man who worshipped order, now a portrait of chaos himself. Julian Thorne, my boss, a man who wouldn't touch a doorknob without a sanitized wipe, was standing barefoot on the cracked, grimy tarmac. His Seville row pajamas, a stark mockery of his usual three-piece armor, were wrinkled and incongruous in the disaster zone. When his frantic, bloodshot eyes finally locked onto mine, a spark of life ignited in their depths, and he began to run. It began, as most of my life did, with work. We were returning from a brutal 3-day negotiation in Berlin. I, Leo, was Julian Thorne's executive assistant, a title that was a polite euphemism for a 24/7 high-functioning satellite. While the rest of the first-class cabin settled in with champagne and warm towels, I was organizing Julian's meeting notes, my mind already 3 steps ahead, planning his schedule for the moment we touched down. Then, a sickening lurch, a sound like the sky tearing itself in half, and the bottom fell out of our world. The descent was terrifyingly swift. The captain's voice, strained and tight, crackled over the intercom with words no one ever wants to hear. Brace for impact. Chaos erupted. The meticulously composed business travelers around me dissolved into their most primal selves. Men in expensive suits were weeping, fumbling with their phones to type out final goodbyes. A woman across the aisle was scribbling furiously on a cocktail napkin, her last will and testament. The cabin was a cacophony of prayer, sobs, and the high, thin shriek of metal under stress. I remained still, an island of eerie calm in the storm. My face was a blank mask, but my hands, hidden at my sides, told a different story. I was gripping the fabric of my trousers so tightly that I could feel the skin on my knuckles splitting. An orphan since I was young, I ran a quick inventory of my 25 years on Earth and came up empty. No family to mourn me, no close friends to miss my presence. My entire existence was a closed loop: wake, work for Julian, sleep, repeat. A bitter, slow smile touched my lips. In the face of oblivion, my life felt like a joke. And that gave me an idea. I remembered the satellite phone Julian had insisted I carry, a leash to ensure he could reach me even in the most remote corners of the globe. My breathing hitched, becoming ragged and shallow. I pulled it out, my fingers surprisingly steady, and found my chat with him. The plane jolted again, a violent shudder that sent a briefcase flying through the air. It clipped my head hard. A sharp, starburst of pain exploded behind my eyes and a warm, wet trickled down my temple. I touched my face, my hand came away slick with blood. The detached calm shattered. Fear, cold and absolute, finally pierced my armor. Silent tears began to stream down my cheeks, mixing with the blood. The primal terror of death was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. I clutched the phone, my fingers smearing the screen with red as I typed with a new, frantic urgency. This wasn't just a prank anymore. It felt like a final, desperate truth. Hey boss. Long story short, I'm in love with you. The blood dripping into my eyes blurred my vision. I hastily wiped them with the back of my other hand and continued, my own words moving me in a way I hadn't expected. The silent tears turned into gut-wrenching sobs, and soon I was wailing just like everyone else, mourning a life I never really lived and a love I never dared to speak. Like, really, really in love with you. Julian Thorne was a terrible, brilliant boss. A genius, yes. Meticulous, handsome, and a notorious neat freak. He was also generous in his own detached way, paying me a salary that was obscene for my age. But he owned me. My time, my energy, my life. I had no one else. As I wept for myself, the plane pitched violently one last time. A flight attendant was thrown across the aisle, tumbling toward me. My thumb hit send on the final message, "Goodbye, boss," just as the phone was knocked from my grasp. Instinct took over. I caught the flight attendant, pulling her into a tight embrace to shield her as my own body braced for the end. Holding someone, I realized, made the prospect of dying feel a fraction less lonely. Then, a miracle. A roar of engines fighting back, a gut-wrenching pull against gravity. The pilot, drawing on decades of experience, was wrestling the wounded bird back from the brink. The screaming in the cabin slowly morphed into a collective, ragged gasp of disbelief. When the wheels finally, blessedly, screeched against the runway, I was still clenching my teeth, my eyes squeezed shut, holding the unconscious flight attendant for dear life. A tidal wave of cheers and hysterical sobs washed over the cabin. I opened my eyes. Outside the window, the night was ablaze with the flashing lights of an army of emergency vehicles. We were safe. We were alive. And I, Leo, had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of my life. The wave of cheers that washed over the cabin was a strange, hysterical sound, the noise of people who had stared into the abyss and found it blinked first. I remained frozen, my arms locked around the flight attendant, the dead weight of her estranged comfort. It took a full half-hour before the controlled chaos of the emergency response reached our section of the plane. Paramedics, their faces grim and focused, moved with practiced efficiency. They gently took the woman from my arms, and I watched with a detached sense of relief as they fitted a neck brace around her. At least she was alive. At least my last act wouldn't have been a failure. When a paramedic finally turned to me, his flashlight beam dancing across my blood-caked face, I found I could still stand. My legs were shaky, a deep, thrumming ache had settled into my bones, but nothing felt broken. I was guided down the emergency slide, my expensive suit trousers catching and tearing on the way down, a triviality that my brain registered with absurd clarity. On the tarmac, the air was thick with the smells of jet fuel and ozone. I was just another survivor, a face in the crowd of the walking wounded, being herded by an airport staff member toward a waiting ambulance. That's when I felt it. A pull, a strange sense of being watched, as if a single thread connected me to someone across the sea of flashing lights and frantic movement. My head turned, as if guided by an unseen hand, and I saw him. There, surrounded by a phalanx of his ever-present bodyguards in their funereal black suits, was Julian Thorne. The world narrowed to a single, frantic point of focus. The screams, the sirens, the organized chaos of the rescue operation, it all faded into a muted hum. Even from this distance, I could see the state he was in, and it shocked me to my core. The man whose suits were custom-tailored, whose shoes were always polished to a mirror shine, whose entire being screamed control and untouchable perfection, was wearing nothing but a pair of silk pajamas. His dark hair was a mess, and his feet, my God, his feet were bare. His pale, aristocratic feet were planted directly on the dusty, oil-stained tarmac, a walking violation of his own sacred, germophobic rules. The instant our eyes met, his dead, bloodshot gaze seemed to ignite. A flicker of something wild and desperate flared within them. And then he ran. He didn't walk, he didn't stride. He ran like a man possessed, like the hounds of hell were at his heels. His bodyguards, caught completely off guard, scrambled to follow, a swarm of black suits chasing a specter in blue silk. The scene was so bizarre, so out of place amidst the genuine disaster, that few people seemed to notice. By the time he reached me, my heart, which had somehow remained steady through a near-fatal plane crash, was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. I hadn't died in a fireball in the sky, but I was certain I was about to have a coronary on the ground. He didn't slow down. The collision was less of a hug and more of an anchor being dropped, a desperate attempt to stop the world from spinning. His arms wrapped around me, a crushing, trembling embrace. I could feel the frantic thud of his heart against my own chest, a frantic, terrified rhythm that matched mine. And then, in the cold, desperate embrace of the man I had just lied to, the man who now looked more broken than I felt, the world finally went black. I awoke to the muted beeping of a machine and the sterile scent of antiseptic. The world was a uniform, blinding white, white ceiling, white walls, white sheets. A transparent tube snaked from a bag of fluid into the back of my hand, held in place by a strip of white tape. A nurse with a kind, tired face noticed my eyes fluttering open and bustled out, murmuring something about fetching the doctor. My head felt heavy and swollen, and when I gingerly raised a hand to touch it, I found it was wrapped in a thick layer of bandages, like a mummy in a B-movie. Slowly, like fragments of a shattered mirror, the memories pieced themselves back together. The plane, the violent jolt, the blood, the message. Oh God, the message. And then, the tarmac. Julian running, his face a mask of desperation. His bare feet. The crushing hug. The darkness. Holy crap. I confess my love, albeit as a morbid joke, to my boss. And then my germophobic, emotionally constipated boss ran across a filthy airport tarmac without shoes on and hugged me until I passed out. A wild, impossible thought took root in my mind. Could he actually like me? The idea was so foreign, so utterly at odds with the man I'd worked for years, that I almost laughed. Julian Thorne did not like people. He assessed their value, utilized their skills, and compensated them accordingly. If he liked someone, wouldn't he give them less work? Wouldn't there be some form of special treatment beyond a higher-than-average salary? Wouldn't he have ever, in 5 years, offered a single word of personal encouragement that wasn't directly tied to a successful project? The logic didn't hold. It had to be shock. Relief that his most valuable asset wasn't about to be scraped off a mountainside. That had to be it. Just as I was solidifying this much more sensible conclusion, the door to my private room burst open. Speak of the devil. Julian walked in, looking much more like his usual self. He was dressed in a crisp, dark gray suit, his hair perfectly coiffed. Only the faint, lingering redness in his eyes and a certain tightness around his jaw betrayed the morning's chaos. He was followed by a doctor, and he stood to the side, his arms crossed, a stern, unreadable expression on his face, while the doctor performed his examination. I suddenly felt intensely awkward, the thin hospital gown offering no defense against his penetrating gaze. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The doctor finished his checkup, declaring that I had no major issues, just a concussion, multiple soft tissue bruises, and a nasty gash on my head that required 7 stitches. I would need to be monitored. I nodded, feeling as fragile as he described. Once the medical staff had left, the silence in the room became a physical presence. Julian didn't speak. He just stared at me with that complicated, intense expression. His gaze was making my skin crawl, and I knew I had to break the tension before it suffocated me. I defaulted to the only language we truly shared. "Boss," I began, my voice a little hoarse. "Does this count as a work-related injury?" "No," he said. His voice was cold, distant, devoid of any warmth. My spirit, which had been tentatively trying to float, sank like a stone. A wave of hurt and bitterness washed over me. "Of course not. Why would it be?" "Okay," I mumbled, looking down at the pristine white sheets. "Well, I have insurance anyway." I took a deep breath, knowing what I had to do next. I had to erase it, take it all back. "By the way, boss, that message I sent you on the plane? It was a joke." Julian's expression finally changed. The mask of indifference cracked, replaced by a glacial coldness. "A joke?" Yeah, I forced a laugh, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the sterile room. "You know, a little gallows humor. That way, if, well, you know, you'd remember your most loyal assistant." Huh. My pathetic attempt at humor made his face darken completely. "You've lost this month's bonus." "What?" I couldn't believe it. The hurt and bitterness vanished, incinerated by a sudden fire of pure outrage. "You cheapskate. I was on a business trip for you, trying to land a multi-million-dollar project. I nearly died. And not only is this not a work injury, but you're docking my bonus." I pushed myself up, ignoring the throbbing in my head. "Julian, I never knew you could be so heartless. Even if I were just a regular colleague, you should show some concern. I'm a patient, not your sworn enemy." I was roaring now, my voice raw with disbelief and a deep, aching sense of injustice. I wanted to curse him out, to scream every foul word I knew, but staring at his ridiculously, infuriatingly handsome face, the words wouldn't come. "Damn it," I seethed, pounding a fist on the edge of the bed. "I quit. I'm done." "You can't," he stated, his voice flat and absolute. "You signed a 10-year contract." Oh, The injustice of it all. The emotional whiplash was too much. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the white walls of the room swirling into a gray vortex. My vision went black at the edges, and I fell straight back onto the pillows, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The man who had been a statue of cold fury just a moment ago lunged forward in a panic, his hands catching my shoulders, his strong fingers digging into me as he pulled me into his arms, stopping my head from hitting the headboard. My head throbbed, and through the haze of pain and anger, I suddenly remembered his frantic hug at the airport and the shocking sight of his bare feet. "Julian," I whispered, my voice weak. "Why weren't you wearing any shoes back then?" His lips were pressed into a thin, white line. He seemed to be wrestling with some immense internal battle before his deep voice sounded, low and rough, right next to my ear. "When you said you liked me, was it a lie?" "Of course," I answered, the word escaping my lips without a second thought, a reflex born of years of self-preservation. A lie to protect a secret I couldn't bear to have exposed, only to be crushed. I felt, more than heard, the soft exhale of breath beside my ear, as if a great, unbearable weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Relief. The sound was unmistakable. A sharp, bitter ache bloomed in my chest. Of course, he was relieved. The last thing Julian Thorne would want is his emotionally stunted, workaholic assistant harboring a genuine, pathetic crush. No one knew the truth. That for years, I had been waging a silent war with my own heart, methodically brainwashing myself into believing the feelings weren't real, that they were just a byproduct of proximity and dependence. No one knew that on that plane, staring death in the face, I had used the guise of a joke to finally tell him the truth. I had figured, what did it matter? Whether he believed it or not, whether he was horrified or amused, at least I would have said it. I would have died with no regrets. But I never, in all my morbid imaginings, expected this outcome. To survive, only to have my fragile, secret love stomped on and dismissed so coldly. It was, I thought, with a fresh wave of misery, doomed from the very start. Julian gently laid me back down on the bed, his touch now carefully impersonal. The moment of raw emotion had passed, and the familiar, unbridgeable distance between us was re-established. I closed my eyes, feigning exhaustion, desperate to escape the suffocatingly awkward atmosphere. A short while later, I heard the soft click of the door as he left. He didn't abandon me completely. True to form, his solution was efficient and expensive. He arranged for a full-time private caregiver, and my hospital room was the kind of deluxe suite with a fruit basket that probably cost more per night than my first apartment's monthly rent. It was, essentially, a state-sanctioned, officially paid sick leave. I was determined to milk it for every second I could. During my 10-day hospital stay, Julian didn't visit again. Not once. The caregiver, a pleasant woman named Martha, brought me a new phone, a replacement for the one lost to the chaos on the plane. The first thing I did, out of a masochistic habit I couldn't break, was log back into our company's internal messaging system. I scrolled through the endless backlog of messages. The main channels were filled with chatter about the near-fatal crash of Flight 117. Everyone was praising the heroic pilot, sharing news articles and eyewitness accounts. Standard corporate commiseration. But then I navigated to the private, off-the-record group chat for the executive floor. And that's where I saw it. The messages from the last couple of days were buzzing with a new piece of gossip. Julian was bringing his new girlfriend to inspect the company. My eyes widened. I held the phone with both hands, my knuckles white, staring intently at the screen as if I could will the words to change. Someone named Chloe from marketing had even managed to snap a photo from behind and posted it in the chat. The picture was slightly blurry, taken from a distance, but it was unmistakably them. Julian, in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, was turned to the side, his head inclined as he spoke to a woman. She was beautiful, with a gentle, elegant air about her. And from the angle of the photo, I could see the expression on Julian's face. It was a look of softness, of genuine tenderness. A look I had never, not in 5 years of near constant proximity, ever seen directed at me. I felt the air leave my lungs. My carefully constructed composure, the fragile peace I had found in the quiet of my hospital room, shattered into a million pieces. The throbbing in my head, which had subsided to a dull ache, returned with a vengeance, a sharp, blinding pain that felt like a physical blow. I clutched my head, a strangled gasp escaping my lips, and writhed on the bed. Martha saw my distress and immediately ran out, calling for a doctor. But the doctor was too late. In the span of a heartbeat, the sterile white room dissolved. I was back on the plane. The scent of antiseptic was replaced by the smell of fear and burning electronics. I was surrounded by the desperate, weeping faces of my fellow passengers, their cries a deafening chorus of despair. I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. It felt like this whole thing, the safe landing, the hospital, Julian's visit, had been a dream, a cruel hallucination conjured in my dying moments. I shook my head desperately, trying to clear the vision, but my surroundings didn't change. The sharp screams, the sickening crash of luggage falling from the overhead bins, the red haze that clouded my vision. I touched my head again, and my hand came back wet with warm, sticky blood. The terror was absolute, a primal scream trapped in my throat. I was still on the plane. It hadn't landed. Everything else had been a pre-death hallucination. There was no Julian running barefoot across the tarmac, no awkward, heartbreaking conversation between us. I trembled, clutching my head and finally screaming, "No, I don't want to die. I don't want to." If I hadn't been given that tiny, fleeting glimpse of warmth, that false hope that maybe, just maybe, I mattered, I wouldn't be this afraid of death. As the plane nosedived toward the unforgiving ground, a sea of fire erupted before my eyes, swallowing me whole. When consciousness returned, it was in fragments, like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing I registered was the murmur of voices, hushed and serious. A psychiatric condition. Yes. And it doesn't seem to be from the plane incident alone. He's likely had this for a long time. A recent trigger, a significant emotional trauma, caused a relapse. It was the doctor's voice, calm and clinical. Then another voice, lower, laced with a gravelly texture I knew better than my own. Julian's. His parents are gone. The rest of his family has passed away. He hasn't had an easy life. You said keeping him busy would help him forget the pain. And it did, for a time, the doctor replied. But it was a bandage, not a cure. The underlying issues were still there. It's my fault. Julian's voice was barely a whisper, raw with a self-recrimination so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air. I ignored his mental health. I just kept piling on the work. My thoughts swirled in a disoriented haze. How did Julian know all that? The sparse, bleak details of my past were something I kept locked away, buried under layers of professional competence. By the time I was fully awake, the doctor was gone. Julian sat in the chair beside my bed, a silent, brooding statue. He was just watching me, his gaze fixed on the ceiling above my head as if searching for answers in the acoustic tiles. "You're awake?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," I croaked, my throat dry. "Julian, are you real?" I couldn't be sure. The hallucination, the terror, the all-consuming sea of fire had felt more real than this quiet, sterile room. The phantom hiss of my own hair burning still seemed to echo in my ears. Julian wore his usual deadpan expression. It was a rare and momentous occasion to see any other emotion cross that chiseled face. But his actions, once again, defied his stoic demeanor. He took both of my hands in his. They were warm and strong. Then he gently guided them to his face. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cool skin of his cheek, the sharp line of his jaw, the prominent bridge of his nose. The unexpected intimacy of the act sent a jolt through my system. By the time I fully processed what was happening, my hands had been cupping his face for several seconds. I snatched them back as if I'd been burned, my own face heating with a furious blush. My whole body felt awkward and exposed. "I'm real," he said, his voice so gentle it was completely disarming. It made me wonder, just for a foolish, hopeful second, if he actually cared. "Don't be afraid." He paused, letting his words settle in the quiet room. "Don't worry about work." The doctor says you can be discharged, but he recommends a stress-free environment for a while. He cleared his throat, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. You don't have anyone at home to take care of you. So, why don't you move in with me for a while? I have a housekeeper who can look after things. My eyes widened in shock. Julian Thorne, the man who treated his personal space like a holy sanctuary, was inviting me into his home? The little ripple of hope in my heart, the one I kept trying to drown, bobbed stubbornly back to the surface. He must have seen the hope, the question, in my eyes, because he coughed twice and quickly added the caveat. After all, you are my most capable assistant. I need you back at full operational capacity. And just like that, the ripple was gone, the hope submerged once more. I was an asset. A very valuable, currently malfunctioning asset that needed careful maintenance. Just then, his phone, resting on the bedside table, began to vibrate. I glanced over and saw the name on the screen, Sophie. The name of the woman from the picture. His new girlfriend. Julian answered the call, and his voice, the same voice that had been so cold and clipped with me earlier, transformed. It filled with a warmth, a deep, resonant tenderness I had never heard from him before, not even in my most secret, desperate daydreams. I remembered the photo Chloe had sent, the soft look on his face as he spoke to her. So that's how it is. A bitter, hollow laugh threatened to bubble up from my chest. I swallowed it down. I was his broken machine. She was the one who got the tenderness. Despite the crushing realization, I still went home with him. Because as much as my heart ached, another part of me was terrified. I was scared of being alone in my empty apartment. I was scared of closing my eyes and finding myself back on that plane. I was scared of the sea of fire, of the suffocating, absolute despair of death. And Julian, for all the pain he caused me, felt like the only solid thing in a world that had become terrifyingly unstable. Julian's home was not an apartment. It was a sprawling, glass-walled palace in the sky that occupied the entire top floor of one of downtown's most prestigious high-rises. Over 4,000 square feet of minimalist luxury, with panoramic views that made the city below look like a glittering circuit board. A housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, came daily to clean and prepare meals with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, leaving just after dinner. Most of the time, it was just the two of us, existing in a state of strange, silent domesticity. He was adamant that I wasn't to think about work. He informed me I was on a mandatory 2-week leave, and that Larry, his perpetually stressed-out secondary assistant, would be handling my duties. The anxiety of being sidelined, of being replaced, gnawed at me. I could barely eat. The food Mrs. Gable prepared was exquisite, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I only started to calm down after Julian, looking genuinely concerned by my skeletal appearance, repeatedly assured me that he wasn't firing me, just forcing me to rest. Honestly, physically, I was fine. The stitches were out, the bruises were fading. But my emotions were a chaotic, unpredictable storm. I'd be numb and apathetic one moment, then plunged into a deep, bone-weary sadness the next, followed by a spike of irrational, jittery happiness. This constant, exhausting cycle left me with a crippling case of insomnia. I didn't want Julian to worry. The thought of being a further burden was unbearable, so I developed a routine. I would go to my guest's suite early every evening, turn off the lights, and lie there perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark for hours on end. A few times, the door would creak open, and I'd see his silhouette in the hallway light. I learned to fake a soft, rhythmic snore, a performance that seemed to reassure him, and he would quietly close the door and leave. But the charade couldn't hide the truth. I grew thinner by the day, dark circles blooming like bruises under my eyes. Julian's worry became a palpable presence in the apartment. "Leo," he said one evening, his voice startling me from my trance-like state as I stared out at the city lights. "You should go out. Get some fresh air. Or perhaps go to the Maldives for a few days. The company will cover it." "No, it's okay, boss." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "I feel much better. I can go back to work." "No," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're taking another 2 weeks off." A spike of paranoia shot through me. "Boss, are you sure you're not trying to fire me?" Or is something going on at the company? I trailed off, the unspoken question hanging in the air between us. The question was about Sophie. I had seen more photos in the company chat. Julian and Sophie at a charity gala. Julian and Sophie at a high-profile restaurant opening. They looked perfect together, a power couple in the making. The chat was filled with heart emojis and excited speculation. A bitter, acidic feeling churned in my gut. My nights were haunted. I kept dreaming about the plane crash, about the feeling of free falling through the sky. But the dreams had started to merge with my waking life. I dreamt of Julian running to hug me, of Julian arranging my funeral, and, most torturously, of Julian getting married to Sophie. I would wake up with a jolt, my heart pounding, drenched in a cold sweat, filled with a profound sense of world weariness. Maybe I really did have a mental illness. Maybe I was truly broken. One sleepless night, my mind drifted back, further than it had in years. I remembered the first time I ever saw Julian Thorne. It was in 7th grade. My parents had just died in a car accident, and I was living with my ailing grandfather in a tiny, run-down apartment. We were poor, the kind of poor where you dilute the milk with water and hunger is a constant, dull ache in your stomach. My homeroom teacher, a kind woman, organized a fundraiser for me. The prideful, wounded teenager in me was mortified, but then I thought about my grandfather, and how this money would save him from having to scavenge for cans for a little while, and I accepted it. When my teacher gave me the list of donors, I saw a name I didn't recognize. Julian Thorne, $2,000. It was by far the largest amount. The teacher explained he was the top student in the 9th grade, a prodigy from a wealthy family, who had seen the fundraising notice in the office and insisted on donating his entire prize money from a science fair. "You should thank him when you see him," she'd said. I never did. I never wrote him a thank you note, and I never sought him out. I was too ashamed, too aware of the vast chasm between our worlds. Instead, I just watched him from a distance. A boy who seemed to be lit from within, running gracefully on the sports field, his handsome figure drawing cheers from the crowd. That vibrant, confident life force struck a chord deep in my lonely, grieving heart. For the very first time, I understood the word like. And in that same moment, I knew I was different. I buried the feeling, a cowardly palpitation of my youth. Years passed. Then, as a freshman in high school, I saw him again. He was a senior, the boyishness replaced by an aloof, handsome maturity. The jolt in my heart was instant, a frantic, terrifying beat against my ribs. He was walking down the crowded hallway and his cool, intelligent eyes happened to glance my way. I couldn't tear my gaze away. He seemed to pause for just a second, and then, under my unwavering stare, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips before he turned and walked away. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my entire body trembling. I was terrified my little secret had been discovered. That was the year my grandfather died. My world collapsed. I had no money for the next semester, let alone for food. I dropped out of school. Before I left, I did the boldest thing of my life. I bought the cheapest stationery I could find and wrote Julian a confession letter. On my last day, I gathered every ounce of courage I possessed and asked a senior girl in his class to pass it on to him. And that was it. My secret love, my schoolboy crush, ended there. Our paths diverged into different universes. I never thought I would see him again. The next day, needing to escape the suffocating silence of the apartment, I went for a walk. And ran straight into a ghost from that past. Leo? Leo Vance? Is that really you? I turned to see a man with a warm, familiar smile. Then, my old high school class president. He gave me a hug that was surprisingly genuine, chattering excitedly about the good old days. He didn't mention my poverty or my sudden disappearance, only the pure joy of seeing a long-lost friend. "Leo, we're having a class reunion tomorrow night," he said, his eyes sparkling. "You have to come." I refused instantly. I didn't really know those people. Back then, I was too busy surviving to make friends. Only Ben had ever been kind to me. "Don't say no," he insisted. "A lot of people cared about you. Grace. Chloe even had a crush on you." She cried for a week after you left. I stared at him, my eyes wide with disbelief. In school, I was a skinny, sallow-skinned ghost. A girl had a crush on me? Ben laughed. I'm not kidding. You had this broody, princely vibe. Come on, please. We can catch up. I hesitated. I was making a six-figure salary now. I wore custom suits and a Patek Philippe watch. I suppose, I thought with a flicker of pride, I had finally earned the right to make some friends. I agreed. Ben was thrilled, immediately pulling me into an impromptu selfie and posting it in their group chat, announcing my triumphant return. I sighed, but a small part of me felt a nervous flutter of excitement. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living a life. The morning of the reunion, I found Julian already in the dining room, sipping black coffee and scrolling through something on a tablet. The early morning light caught the silver at his temples, making him look distinguished and intimidatingly powerful. I'll go with you to get your final checkup today, he said without looking up. You don't have to, boss. I can go by myself, I replied, my automatic assistant response kicking in. After that, I'm going to a class reunion. He finally looked up, his brow furrowed slightly. A reunion? Yeah, I nodded, feeling a strange need to explain myself. High school. He considered this for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Okay, don't drink. And come back early. It was an order, not a suggestion, but it was tinged with something that sounded almost like concern. At the hospital, the doctor pronounced me fully recovered, at least physically. He asked how I'd been feeling, and I admitted my insomnia was severe. He looked at me with a kind, professional sympathy. I have a friend, a PhD in psychology, he said, pulling a business card from his wallet. Talking to him might help with your sleep. He's very discreet. I took the card, a flicker of hope igniting within me. Maybe I wasn't irrevocably broken. Maybe I could be fixed. I took a cab to the restaurant, a chic, well-known establishment downtown. The entire ride, I was a bundle of nervous energy, smoothing my trousers, checking my watch, feeling like an imposter. Ben was waiting for me at the entrance, his grin wide and welcoming. He slung an arm around my shoulder and led me into a private room buzzing with conversation and laughter. The moment we entered, a woman with a stylish short haircut and bright, intelligent eyes exclaimed, Leo. It was Chloe. Wow, my high school crush. You really came. She was open and bubbly, and her directness, which should have made me blush, instead put me at ease. She insisted I sit next to her, and the reunion was, for a while, surprisingly pleasant. People were friendly, curious, and welcoming. I started to relax, sipping on a glass of juice, feeling for the first time in a long time like a normal person, not just an assistant. The mood soured when a man named Derek, a sneering, arrogant classmate I vaguely remembered as a bully, got drunk. He began taunting me, his words dripping with condescension. Hey you, Leo, he slurred, pointing a finger at my juice. After all, we all donated money to you back in the day. I gave $100. That was enough to feed your family for a week. A chill fell over the room. Ben tried to intervene, but Derek was on a roll, bragging about his small-time companies and sucking up to anyone he deemed important. When he found out I was an assistant, he scoffed loudly. What kind of company hires a high school dropout as an assistant? Tell us the name, so we know which ones to avoid. Chloe slammed her hand on the table. Derek, will you ever shut up? The confrontation escalated, with Derek turning his misogynistic venom on her. I found the whole display so pathetic that I actually let out a small laugh. I leaned back in my chair, channeling the effortless authority I had learned from years of observing Julian. In the corporate world, no one dared speak to me like that. I was Julian Thorne's right-hand man, the executive CEO with 50% decision-making power. I was no longer that skinny, starving boy. Derek, I said, my voice calm and level. What's the name of your company? He sneered, puffing out his chest. Infinite Media and Infinite Electronics. I almost laughed out loud. I had heard of them. Comparing them to Thorne Industries was like comparing a puddle to the Pacific Ocean. What? Never heard of it, I said with a dismissive shrug, turning my attention back to Chloe. My indifference infuriated him. He spent the rest of the evening drinking heavily and trying to reassert his dominance. As the night wound down and I prepared to slip out, Derek cornered me, slinging a reeking, sweaty arm around my shoulders. "Leo," he snarled, "you're into guys, aren't you?" The world stopped. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. The blood rushed to my head, a roaring in my ears. This was my deepest secret, my most profound shame. How could he possibly know? Seeing my horrified expression, he grew even more smug. "You all might not know this," he announced to the room, "but I do. I know this older girl from our school. And guess what? Our dear Leo wrote a love letter to a boy." He was enjoying this, relishing my humiliation. "That girl is a friend of mine. She told me Leo asked her to pass a love letter to some guy in her class." I had never been so scared in my life. I was terrified he would say Julian's name. My blood ran cold. "Derek, shut the hell up," Chloe yelled. "I don't know who he wrote the letter to," Derek continued, ignoring her, his eyes fixed on my face. "But my friend said she found it so disgusting, she threw it in the trash." He roared with laughter. A strange mix of relief and loss washed over me. He hadn't said Julian's name. But the letter, my one brave, desperate act, had never even reached him. Derek was still ranting, furious at my silence, when a deep, cold voice cut through the room from the doorway. Why should he talk to a clown? Everyone turned. My heart stopped. It was Julian. And standing beside him, looking elegant and composed, was Sophie. I felt my head was going to explode. Today was officially the worst day of my life. Julian walked into the room, his presence immediately commanding all the attention. He stared at Derek with eyes so cold they could have frozen fire. "You tell me, why should he bother with a clown like you?" Derek, suddenly sober, stammered, "Mr. Thorne. A misunderstanding. We were just joking around." He fumbled for a business card. "I'm Derek Wu, from Infinite Electronics. We have a partnership with Thorne Industries." "Oh, is that so?" Julian took out his phone and made a call. "Larry, terminate all cooperation with Infinite Electronics. Blacklist them. Effective immediately." Derek's face went white. He started to babble, apologizing, making excuses. Julian ignored him and looked at me, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he held out a hand. "Leo, come here." I walked toward him as if in a trance. Everyone was staring. It was only then that Derek realized Julian was defending me. Julian's next words were spoken to the entire room, but his eyes were on Derek. "Leo taught himself enough to get into a top-tier university, earning a double master's degree with an IELTS score of 8.5. He is self-taught in Japanese, Spanish, and French. He is the executive CEO of my company, my top assistant, with a salary you could only dream of. What right do you have to look down on him?" A stunned silence filled the room, followed by a murmur of impressed whispers. My classmates were looking at me with new eyes, with respect. Derek looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Julian announced that Thorne Industries would be picking up the tab for the reunion, then turned and led me out of the room. In the lobby, Sophie was waiting patiently. The bitter feeling returned with a vengeance. "You're on a date," I said, my voice flat. "I'll head back by myself. I won't bother you." I started to walk away, but Julian grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly tight. He led me over to Sophie. "Sophie," he said, his voice clipped. "I'll have the driver take you home. Larry will follow up on the GC Corporation collaboration." Sophie smiled brightly. "Okay, cousin. I won't keep you. My boyfriend is getting impatient anyway." And with a cheerful wave, she scurried away. "Cousin?" Julian didn't say anything. He just grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the exit. His grip was so tight my bones ached, and a strange heat seemed to travel from his palm directly into my heart. We were home in record time. The moment the apartment door closed behind us, his composure finally broke. He grabbed my shoulders, his breathing heavy, and pinned me against the wall. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, intense growl. "That love letter you gave a girl in high school, it was meant for someone else, wasn't it?"